The desert wind scraped across the cracked asphalt of Route 127 as Detective Laura Brennan stepped out of her patrol car, squinting against the late afternoon glare. 11 years had passed since Park Ranger David Nguyen disappeared somewhere in this unforgiving stretch of the Mojave, and for 11 years his case file had gathered dust in the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. Now, thanks to a hiker who'd stumbled upon a weathered logbook wedged between boulders near Kelso Dunes, everything had changed. The logbook's final entries painted a picture of a man who'd noticed something troubling. Coordinates marked with urgency, notes about unusual vehicle activity near abandoned mine shafts, and a final entry dated October 14, 2014, following tracks to Old Dale Mining District, will radio by 1800 hours. He never made that radio call. Before we continue with this incredible story, I'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support means everything. And now, let's dive deeper into what happened to David Nguyen. Laura had been a rookie deputy when David vanished. She remembered the massive search operation, helicopters sweeping the basin, K9 units tracking scent trails that evaporated in the heat, volunteers combing through Joshua tree forests and canyon washes. His pickup truck had been found 3 days later, abandoned near a collapsed mine shaft 20 miles from his last known position. The keys were still in the ignition, his water bottles were full. His radio sat on the dashboard, switched off. The original investigation had concluded that David likely suffered heat exhaustion and wandered into the desert, becoming disoriented. His body, they assumed, lay somewhere beneath the sand, claimed by the elements. His wife, Jennifer, had never accepted that explanation. Neither had his partner, Ranger Thomas Vega, who'd retired 2 years after the disappearance, unable to shake the guilt of not being there that day. Thomas had told anyone who would listen that David was too experienced, too careful, too dedicated to make the kind of mistakes that would lead to his death. But without evidence, without leads, the case had gone cold, like so many others in the vast expanse of the Mojave. Now, with the logbook recovered, Laura had convinced her captain to reopen the case. She'd spent the past week studying David's notes, cross-referencing the coordinates he'd marked, and building a timeline of his final patrol. The picture emerging was far more complex than anyone had imagined. David had been investigating something that had consumed his final weeks of life. David had been with the National Park Service for 8 years when he disappeared. His personnel file showed a man dedicated to his work, beloved by visitors, respected by his colleagues. He'd grown up in Orange County, the son of Vietnamese immigrants who'd built a small restaurant business through decades of hard work. David had studied environmental science at UC Riverside, met Jennifer there, and after graduation, they'd moved to the high desert where he could pursue his dream of protecting California's wilderness areas. They'd bought a small house in Victorville, close enough to his posting at the Mojave National Preserve that he could be home most nights, far enough that they had privacy and space. In the weeks before his disappearance, David's logbook showed repeated visits to the same remote areas, places where official park business rarely took him. He'd documented tire tracks, photographed disturbed soil, and noted license plate numbers of vehicles that didn't belong to park visitors or mining company personnel. One name appeared multiple times in his entries. Gray van, no plates, seen near Vulcan mine entrance. The van had been spotted on September 28th, October 2nd, October 5th, and October 9th. Each time, David had noted the approximate time, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., hours when legitimate visitors would be unlikely to venture into such remote territory. Laura pulled out her tablet, reviewing the digitized pages of the logbook. David's handwriting grew more urgent as October progressed. The letters pressed harder into the page, the notes growing longer and more detailed. On October 10th, he'd written, confronted two men loading something at old processing site. They left quickly when they saw my truck. One was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing dark clothing. The other, shorter, stockier build. Both had flashlights with red filters. Took photos, need to develop. They seemed nervous, aggressive even. The tall one stepped toward me before the other pulled him back. Got partial plate, 7BX. Bay. The entry ended there, as if David had been interrupted or had seen something that demanded his immediate attention. On October 12th, 2 days before his disappearance, he'd written, Jennifer worried. Says I should report to county sheriff. But need more evidence first. Whatever they're doing out here, it's organized and deliberate. Found fresh tire tracks leading to 3 different mine sites today. All old gold mines, all supposedly sealed, but the padlocks on the gates are new. Someone has keys. Tomorrow I'll stake out the Vulcan site overnight, see if the van returns. Will tell Thomas my route in case anything happens. But David hadn't told Thomas his route. Thomas had been scheduled for 2 days off, and David had apparently decided to go ahead with his surveillance alone. It was the kind of decision that Laura understood. A dedicated ranger who didn't want to pull his partner back from family time, who thought he could gather just a bit more evidence before making an official report, who underestimated the danger he was walking into. The afternoon heat shimmered off the desert floor as Laura drove toward the Old Dale mining district, following the route David had marked in his final entry. The temperature gauge in her car read 94 degrees, unseasonably warm for October, and she could only imagine what it had been like 11 years ago when David had made this same drive. The landscape here was haunted by California's gold rush past. Skeletal remains of mills and smelters, shafts that plunged into darkness, tailing piles that spread across valleys like grey fingers, and the ghosts of towns that had thrived and died within a generation. Old Dale itself was barely a memory now, just foundations and debris scattered across a valley floor. The town had boomed in the 1890s, peaked at around 3,000 residents, and collapsed when the gold played out and the water ran dry. A few hardy souls had clung to the area through the Depression, working small claims and eking out livings from what the earlier miners had missed. But by the 1960s, Old Dale was truly dead, leaving behind only ruins and the kind of isolation that made it perfect for people who wanted to operate unseen. She parked where David's truck had been found, near a chain-link fence marking a particularly dangerous mine shaft. The fence was newer than the surrounding structures, installed after David's disappearance as part of a mine safety initiative funded by the state. Dozens of people had died in abandoned mines over the decades, falling down shafts, getting lost in tunnels, succumbing to bad air or collapsing timbers. The Mojave was full of such death traps, most of them unmarked and unguarded. Laura stepped carefully around the perimeter, studying the ground. 11 years of wind and weather had erased most traces of human activity, but the desert sometimes preserved unexpected evidence in its shadows and crevices. She moved slowly, methodically, working her way outward from where the truck had been positioned. Desert varnish darkened the rocks, Joshua trees stood like sentinels, and somewhere in the distance, a raven called out with a harsh, lonely cry. Behind a collapsed ore cart, partially buried in sand and nearly invisible unless you were looking at exactly the right angle, she found it. A small metal film canister, the kind that hadn't been commonly used since the rise of digital photography. David had mentioned developing photos in his logbook. Everyone had assumed those pictures were lost with him, destroyed by the elements, or buried somewhere in the vast desert. But here it was, protected by its metal shell and the shelter of the ore cart. Laura's hands trembled as she pried open the canister. Inside, protected from the elements by rubber sealing that had somehow maintained its integrity, was a roll of 35mm film. The canister's exterior was weathered and scratched, but the seal had held, Whether the film inside was still viable after 11 years of heat cycles, she couldn't know. But it was the first real evidence that had emerged since David's truck was recovered. She immediately called the forensics lab in San Bernardino, speaking to the senior technician on duty. "I need someone who can develop old film," she said, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. 11-year-old evidence from the Nguyen case. There was a pause on the other end. "That case is reopened?" The technician sounded surprised. "I remember when that happened. My brother was part of the search and rescue team. As of last week, how fast can you process this?" "If the film hasn't degraded too badly from the temperature extremes, 2, maybe 3 days, I'll prioritize it. Bring it in tonight if you can. I'll put it in cold storage immediately to stabilize whatever images might be there." Laura promised to deliver the canister within 2 hours and continued her survey of the area. The mineshaft where David's truck had been found was one of dozens in the region, this one part of a claim that had been worked sporadically from 1895 through the 1940s. According to records she'd reviewed, the shaft descended about 200 feet before branching into a network of tunnels that followed gold-bearing quartz veins. A partial collapse in 1947 had killed 2 miners and led to the mine's abandonment. Several searches of the accessible portions of the shaft had been conducted after David's disappearance, but the unstable conditions had prevented a complete exploration. Looking at the site now with fresh eyes and David's logbook as context, Laura began to wonder if the original search teams had been looking in the wrong place entirely. David's notes suggested he'd been following vehicle tracks, not hiking into the desert on foot. If something had happened to him, it had likely happened while he was mobile, while he was pursuing whatever he'd discovered. The abandoned truck might have been staged, placed there deliberately to mislead investigators. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and red. Laura took photographs of the area from multiple angles, marked the location where she'd found the film canister with GPS coordinates, and gathered soil samples from the tire tracks that were still faintly visible near the mine entrance. Tracks that were too fresh to be 11 years old, suggesting that someone still visited this remote location with some regularity. While she waited for the film analysis, Laura decided to visit Jennifer Nguyen. The address in David's personnel file led her to a modest ranch house in Victorville, about an hour from the desert. The drive took her through landscape that transitioned from extreme desert to high desert scrubland, passing through the small communities that dotted the region like islands in a sea of sand and rock. She arrived just as the evening light was fading, the house's windows glowing warm against the gathering darkness. The yard was well maintained, with native plants that required little water, a practical choice for someone who understood the desert's harshness and respected its limitations. Agave plants stood like sculptures near the entrance, and a carefully tended garden of California poppies added splashes of color to the drought-tolerant landscape. A weather-worn ceramic nameplate near the door read "Nguyen Family," and Laura felt a pang of sadness, knowing that the family it referenced had been reduced to one. Jennifer answered the door with cautious eyes. She was in her early 50s now, her dark hair streaked with gray, wearing jeans and a faded UC Riverside sweatshirt. Laura could see the same determined expression that had appeared in news footage from 11 years ago, when Jennifer had pleaded for continued search efforts even after officials wanted to scale back operations, when she'd offered a $50,000 reward for information, when she'd organized volunteer search parties that combed the desert for weeks after the official search ended. "Detective Brennan?" Jennifer studied Laura's badge carefully. "You called yesterday about David's logbook." "Yes, ma'am. May I come in? I have some updates I'd like to share with you." The living room was a shrine to memory. Photos of David in his Ranger uniform covered one wall, Him laughing at family barbecues, standing beside his truck with arms crossed and that characteristic confident smile, receiving a commendation from the regional park superintendent. A wedding photo showed a younger Jennifer and David on a beach somewhere, both of them radiant with the kind of happiness that comes from finding exactly the right person at exactly the right time. On a bookshelf, Laura noticed David's college diploma, a folded American flag that must have been presented at a memorial service, and a small collection of rocks and minerals that he'd apparently collected over the years. "I never believed he just wandered off," Jennifer said, settling into an armchair that faced the photo wall. "David knew that desert better than anyone. He'd been working there for 8 years. He could navigate by stars, by landmarks, by the position of the sun. He wouldn't make rookie mistakes about water or navigation, and he wouldn't turn off his radio during a patrol. Never. That radio was his lifeline, and he treated it with respect." Laura sat on the couch across from her, pulling out her tablet to show Jennifer the digitized logbook pages. "The logbook suggests he was investigating something. Did he mention anything to you? Anything unusual he'd seen in the weeks before he disappeared?" Jennifer's fingers traced the arm of her chair, a nervous gesture that suggested she'd been over these memories countless times. He'd become preoccupied, started carrying a personal camera in addition to his work equipment. Said he was documenting wildlife for a project he was working on, but I knew better. David couldn't lie to me, not really. We'd been together since college. I could read his moods, his silences. I knew when something was bothering him. "When did you first notice the change?" "Late September, maybe the last week of the month. He came home one night around midnight, which was unusual. His shift was supposed to end at 6. He said he'd been doing paperwork at the ranger station, but his uniform was dusty and he had that look, like he'd seen something that troubled him. I asked what was wrong, and he said it was probably nothing, just some people camping in restricted areas. But David had dealt with illegal campers before. This was different." Laura made notes on her tablet as Jennifer continued. "Over the next 2 weeks, he became more withdrawn. He'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner, staring at maps of the preserve, marking locations with a pencil. When I asked what he was doing, he'd say he was planning patrol routes, but I could see it wasn't routine work. He was obsessed with something." "Did he mention specific locations, specific people?" "He talked about the old mining areas, said there was activity there that didn't make sense. Vehicles coming and going at odd hours, people who scattered when they saw his truck approaching. He showed me some photos he'd taken, just distant shots of tire tracks and disturbed ground, nothing that seemed particularly alarming to me. But David was trained to read the desert. He could see things that other people would miss." Jennifer stood and walked to a desk in the corner of the room. She pulled out a folder and handed it to Laura. Inside were the photos David had shown her, printouts of digital images showing tire tracks in sand, disturbed soil near mine entrances, and one distant shot of what might have been a vehicle, though it was too far away to make out details. "I kept these," Jennifer said. "After he disappeared, I gave copies to the investigators, but they didn't seem to think they were important. They were focused on finding David, not on what he'd been investigating. And honestly, at the time, I didn't care either. I just wanted my husband back." Laura studied the photos carefully. They were dated September 28th, October 2nd, October 5th. The metadata showed they'd been taken with a Canon digital camera, probably David's personal equipment. The images were grainy and taken from considerable distance, but they showed clear evidence of recent vehicle activity in areas that should have been largely undisturbed. "Mrs. Nguyen, I found something today that changes everything. I found a film canister at the site where David's truck was abandoned. Inside is a roll of undeveloped film, possibly the photos he mentioned taking just before he disappeared, the photos that might show what he saw. Jennifer's hand went to her mouth, and for the first time since Laura arrived, something like hope flickered across her face. 11 years. I've waited 11 years to hear those words. Do you think? I think David was onto something serious. I think he documented evidence of criminal activity, and I think whoever was responsible knew he was getting close. The film is being processed now. If those photos show what I believe they show, we might finally understand what happened. Jennifer sat back down, her composure cracking slightly. I've imagined this moment so many times. Imagined someone coming to tell me they'd found answers. But I'd almost given up hope. The case went cold so quickly. After the first few months, no one was returning my calls. The reward money I offered, no one came forward with useful information. It was like David had simply evaporated into thin air. Tell me about the last time you saw him. The morning of October 14th. Jennifer closed her eyes, and Laura could see her traveling back through time to that morning. He left for work around 5:30 a.m. He wanted to get an early start because he said he had a lot of ground to cover. I made him coffee and packed his lunch. Turkey sandwich, apple, granola bars, the same lunch I'd made him 1,000 times. We stood in the kitchen and talked about normal things. He needed to change the oil in the truck. I wanted to repaint the guest bedroom. We were planning a trip to San Diego for Thanksgiving to visit my parents. Her voice caught. I kissed him goodbye at the door. He turned back halfway to his truck and waved, smiling. That image, that last wave, that last smile, it's burned into my memory. I've replayed it 10,000 times, looking for some sign that he knew he was in danger, some indication that something was wrong. But there was nothing. He looked happy. He looked like a man who was going to work and would be home for dinner. Did he mention where specifically he'd be patrolling that day? He said something about checking on the eastern boundary areas and then swinging by some of the old mining sites. He didn't give me specific names. He usually didn't unless it was somewhere I'd recognize. David was always conscious of not worrying me with the dangers of his job. He dealt with everything from rattlesnakes to illegal weapons to people on drugs. But he never made me feel afraid for him. Laura shared more details from the logbook, explaining David's notes about the grey van, the confrontation with the two men, his plan to conduct overnight surveillance. With each revelation, Jennifer's expression shifted from hope to anger to grief and back again. He should have told someone, Jennifer said finally. He should have called the sheriff's department or told Thomas, or at least told me the full extent of what he was seeing. Why did he have to be so damn thorough? Why couldn't he have asked for help? From what I've learned about your husband, he was the kind of man who wanted to be certain before raising alarms. He didn't want to waste anyone's time on something that might have an innocent explanation. And it got him killed. Jennifer's voice was flat, stating what she'd believed for 11 years, but could now say with renewed certainty. Someone killed my husband because he saw something he shouldn't have seen. Laura couldn't offer false comfort. The evidence was pointing in exactly that direction. I promise you, Mrs. Nguyen, I'm going to find out what happened. Those photos, once they're developed, will give us leads, and I'm not going to let this case go cold again. 2 days later, Laura received the call from the forensics lab. The technician's voice was excited, almost breathless. Detective Brennan, you need to get down here. The film was partially degraded, but we recovered images from about half the roll. And what we found, you need to see this in person. Laura made the drive to San Bernardino in record time, her mind racing with possibilities. The forensics lab was located in a nondescript building downtown, sharing space with the county coroner's office and the crime scene investigation unit. She signed in, received her visitor badge, and was escorted to the photo analysis room, where the technician, a man named Robert Chen, had the developed images spread across a light table. These were taken with a 35mm camera, probably that same Canon he used for the digital photos, Robert explained, but film captures details that early digital cameras missed. Even with degradation, we're seeing things here that are remarkable. The first photo showed the grey van David had mentioned in his logbook. It was parked near what appeared to be a mine entrance, and the image quality was sharp enough to make out details, rust spots on the bumper, a dent in the passenger door, and most importantly, a partial license plate number, 7BXJ49. California plate, Laura noted. Can you enhance that? Already done. I've sent it to DMV for a search. Even if it's 11 years old, we should be able to trace ownership history. The next photos were even more damning. They showed two men loading wooden crates into the van. The images were taken from a distance, probably with a telephoto lens, but the men's faces were partially visible. One was tall and lean, with what appeared to be a military-style haircut. The other was shorter, stockier, with a full beard. Can you run facial recognition on these? I've already started the process, but with the image quality and the age of the photos, it's going to be challenging. We might get lucky if either of them has a criminal record or military service photos on file. The subsequent images showed the interior of what must have been a mine tunnel, lit by flashlights. The photos were grainier here, taken in low-light conditions, but they clearly showed stacks of additional crates and what appeared to be equipment, possibly processing equipment of some kind. What do you think they were doing? Robert asked. Laura studied the images carefully. Based on the location and the clandestine nature of the operation, my first guess would be drugs. The old mines would provide perfect cover for a meth lab or marijuana grow operation. Remote location, no neighbors, multiple escape routes through the tunnels. That was my thought too, but look at this last photo. The final recovered image was partially degraded, the emulsion damaged by heat or time, but it showed something that made Laura's breath catch. It was a closer shot of one of the crates, its lid partially removed. Inside, clearly visible, were what appeared to be military-style weapons, rifles, possibly automatic weapons, stacked in foam padding. Jesus, Laura breathed. He stumbled onto a weapons cache. That would explain why someone might kill to protect their secret, Robert said quietly. We're not talking about a small-time drug operation. This looks like serious illegal arms trafficking. Laura immediately contacted her captain, explained what the photos revealed, and requested backup for a full investigation of the Old Dale mining area. Within hours, a joint task force was assembled involving the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, and the FBI's Criminal Division. The DMV search came back the following morning. The vehicle with plate number 7BXJ49 had been registered to a rental company in Riverside in 2014. The rental records showed it had been leased to a corporation called Desert Freight Solutions, which further investigation revealed to be a shell company with no legitimate business operations. The corporation's listed address was a mailbox service in Barstow, and its registration had been allowed to lapse in 2016. But the rental agreement included the name of the person who'd signed for the vehicle, Kyle Brennan, no relation to Laura, with an address in Needles, California. A background check revealed that Kyle Brennan had a criminal record, including weapons charges, and had died in a motorcycle accident in 2017. However, his known associates included several individuals with connections to white supremacist groups and illegal arms-dealing networks that had been active in the southwestern United States during the mid-2010s. The pieces were falling into place. David had stumbled onto an illegal weapons operation, possibly connected to extremist groups who were using the remote desert mines as storage and transfer points. He'd documented their activities, and when they realized he was onto them, they'd silenced him. The task force moved on the Old Dale mining district with overwhelming force, securing the area and beginning a systematic exploration of the mine tunnels using specialized equipment and trained personnel. What they found exceeded even Laura's darkest expectations. The main shaft that David had been investigating led to a network of tunnels that had been extensively modified. Someone had installed ventilation systems, lighting, and reinforced support beams. Multiple chambers had been converted into storage areas, and while they were now empty, obviously cleared out years ago, forensic evidence suggested they'd been used exactly as David's photos indicated, as a weapons cache, and possibly as a meeting place for criminal organizations. In one of the deeper tunnels, nearly 150 feet underground, they found something else. A collapsed section that newer supports suggested had been deliberately brought down. When the engineering team carefully excavated the rubble using hand tools and remote cameras, they discovered human remains. DNA analysis confirmed what Laura had known in her heart since finding the logbook. The remains were David Nguyen's. The medical examiner determined he died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with being struck with a heavy object. The positioning of the body and the collapsed tunnel suggested he'd been murdered elsewhere, brought to this location, and buried in a deliberately triggered collapse that was meant to ensure his body would never be found. Laura sat in Jennifer Nguyen's living room again, this time with the task force commander and a victim services counselor. Jennifer listened as they explained what they'd found, her face a mask of controlled grief. When they finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "He was right," she finally said. "He knew something was wrong and he was right to investigate. I just wish he'd been more careful. I wish he'd asked for help." "Your husband was a hero," the task force commander said. "His investigation, his photos, they've given us breaks in multiple cases. We're connecting his evidence to weapons trafficking operations that stretched from California to Arizona to Nevada. People he helped us identify are being arrested as we speak. His work will save lives." "But it couldn't save his own," Jennifer said softly. "That's the terrible irony, isn't it? He died protecting people who never even knew they were in danger." The investigation continued for months. The facial recognition on the photos eventually identified one of the men as Raymond Pike, a former Army sergeant with a dishonorable discharge who'd been involved in multiple illegal weapons schemes. Pike had died in a shootout with federal agents in Arizona in 2019 during an unrelated raid. The other man remained unidentified, but informants who were offered deals in exchange for information eventually revealed he'd been known as Dallas, and he'd fled to Mexico shortly after David's disappearance, apparently spooked by the Rangers' investigation. The complete story emerged piece by piece. David had first noticed the suspicious activity in late September 2014. He'd been conducting a routine patrol when he spotted fresh tire tracks leading to an area he knew should have been undisturbed. Following the tracks, he'd discovered the grey van and observed men moving crates. He'd photographed them from a distance with his digital camera, but wanting clearer evidence, he'd returned with his film camera, which had a better telephoto lens. On October 14th, he'd gone back one more time, planning to document their activities comprehensively before making his report. But this time, Pike and Dallas had spotted him. They'd confronted him, and when David tried to leave, they'd attacked him. The film canister had fallen from his pocket during the struggle, rolling under the ore cart, where it would remain hidden for 11 years. They'd killed him, staged his truck near the shaft to make it look like he'd gone exploring and gotten lost, and buried his body deep in the tunnels they'd already been using for their illegal operations. Within weeks, they'd cleared out the cache and disappeared, knowing that even if David's investigation notes were found, the evidence would be gone. What they hadn't counted on was David's thoroughness, his documentation, his photos, his detailed logbook entries that would eventually lead investigators to uncover not just his murder, but an entire criminal network. Jennifer Nguyen held a memorial service for David once his remains were released. The service was attended by hundreds, park rangers from across California, law enforcement officers who'd worked the case, volunteers who'd searched for him, and community members who'd never forgotten the dedicated ranger who'd given his life protecting the desert he loved. Thomas Vega, now in his 70s, spoke about his former partner's dedication and courage. Laura stood at the back of the chapel, watching as Jennifer finally got the closure she'd sought for 11 years. In the months that followed, the National Park Service dedicated a memorial at the Mojave National Preserve Visitor Center, a plaque honoring David Nguyen's service and sacrifice. Jennifer attended the dedication ceremony along with David's parents, who'd flown in from their retirement home in San Jose. The plaque included David's photo in uniform and a quote he'd once shared in an interview with a local newspaper. "The desert teaches us that preservation requires vigilance. We protect these places not just from environmental threats, but from those who would exploit their isolation for illegal purposes." Laura visited the memorial once it was installed, standing in the desert sun and reading the inscription. She thought about the circuitous path that had led to justice, the hiker who'd found the logbook, the remarkably preserved film, the patient forensic work, and the dedication of everyone who'd refused to let David's case remain unsolved. It was a reminder that sometimes answers came not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through persistence, attention to detail, and a refusal to accept convenient explanations. The case had one final twist. 6 months after David's remains were found, a hiker in Joshua Tree National Park discovered a weathered backpack wedged in a rock crevice. Inside was a journal belonging to a man who called himself Dallas. The journal contained rambling entries about paranoia, guilt, and fear. One entry, dated November 2014, read, "Can't stop thinking about the ranger. Didn't have to go that way. Ray said he wouldn't talk, would just scare him off. But things got out of hand. Now I see his face every time I close my eyes. His wife on the news, begging for information. This desert is haunted now." The journal provided confirmation of what investigators already knew, but offered something else. Evidence that even criminals could be tormented by their actions, that guilt could follow someone across borders and through years. Dallas had apparently lived the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, haunted by what he'd done. For Jennifer, the resolution brought a complex mixture of grief and relief. She'd spent 11 years in limbo, unable to fully mourn because there'd been no body, no confirmation, no answers. Now she could finally say goodbye properly. She established a scholarship fund in David's name for students studying environmental science and park management, ensuring that his legacy would continue through future generations of rangers and conservationists. On the first anniversary of finding David's remains, Laura returned to the Old Dale mining district one final time. The site was now permanently sealed, the tunnels filled and the shafts capped to prevent further access. A small cairn of stones marked where David had been found, placed there by his fellow rangers as an informal memorial. Laura added a stone to the pile. A tradition she'd learned signified remembrance and respect. Standing in the desert quiet, she reflected on everything the case had taught her. About persistence and dedication, about the dangers that lurked in isolated places, about the price some people paid for doing what was right. David Nguyen had been a man who saw something wrong and couldn't walk away, even when it would have been safer to do so. That courage had cost him everything, but it had also exposed criminals, prevented future crimes, and ultimately brought justice not just for himself, but for the communities these weapons dealers had threatened. The sun was setting as Laura drove back towards civilization, painting the desert in those same shades of amber and red that she'd seen months earlier when the case reopened. The Mojave stretched out endlessly in all directions, beautiful and harsh and full of secrets. But one secret had finally been revealed, one mystery solved, one ranger's fate finally known. In the landscape that held so many untold stories, David Nguyen's story at least had found its ending. And in that ending there was a kind of peace.